The Modern Warfare 2 campaign is a brilliant showcase of developer Infinity Ward's latest engine, but the fact remains, this is still a cross-gen release. This is still a game built for the older Xbox One and PS4 systems whose releases go back to 2013. And this is still a game that, in multiplayer, in Ground War, or even the just released Warzone 2, you expect an at least acceptable level of frame rate for all squad members. Whether they're playing on an old Xbox One or a brand new Series X, Modern Warfare 2 is still a Call of Duty that aims to satisfy everyone. And that makes sense. The install base for these older machines, the PS4 especially, is just too large to ignore. It's too widely circulated. So the problem is, well, for Call of Duty as a series to push forward, technically, there will come a time where it has to cut ties to these older machines. But for now, Modern Warfare 2, the 2022 reboot, is not that game, and today I really wondered how these last generation consoles are holding up. Yes, Warzone 2 is just out and I'm truly itching to get to it. Today though, well, we're going for one last dip into the core Modern Warfare 2 experience, the campaign and the multiplayer, to see what's really up on last gen. There are a few surprises here too, signs that base Xbox One is showing its age, honestly more so than we're used to seeing from the Call of Duty series. So what's the state of it, and how does that translate to the competitive side online? Meanwhile, is the base PS4 actually acceptable as the presumed target development platform for Modern Warfare 2? And lastly, what of either the enhanced PS4 Pro or Xbox One X editions, where the pecking order in frame rate between all four isn't quite what we'd expect? Let's find out. Let's cut to the chase on this one. Xbox One is improved since the multiplayer beta, though the fact is, the campaign is a challenging, set-piece driven portion of the package. Every level tries something new, so we have the sniping mission with its huge vistas, the Amsterdam mission of course with its realistic materials, and then the swimming sequences. All of these stages really stress test this machine. Our trusty Xbox One hits the top 60 FPS line, sure, but it's really just too often dipping to the 50s, the 40s, and in one particular case, locking to the 30 FPS line as well. It targets 900p as usual with a dynamic setup, taking the resolution down to 50% of that horizontally, 800 by 900 in the worst points. I think honestly the temporal reconstruction of the IW engine does a decent job of turning that into a respectable image in close quarters, except anything with a long view into the distance, the recon by fire sniping mission for example, shows up a kind of blur to the overall image that genuinely affects visibility. There just isn't enough pixel information being pushed on Xbox One to pick out enemies without zooming in, that is. Back to the frame rate. The image quality side is its own issue for Xbox One, but there are clear drawbacks with hitting a remotely stable level of performance too. In this case I'm using the Xbox One S model, so perhaps expect a marginally lower figure on the original VCR model. The range is typically 45 to 60 FPS in most missions, some more successfully hitting the top line than others in fairness, and you get screen tearing right at the top of the frame too on Xbox One and One X models alike. But the real shock is in seeing entire campaign levels nosedive to 30 to 40 FPS. The mission Dark Water is a perfect example. Again, a great set piece on paper. You run across a rain-soaked tanker, taking down enemies, the twist being that the containers on top are unsecured, so you have to dodge huge objects as they dynamically slide across the deck. Now, Xbox One absolutely does not cope with this. We're almost locking to the 30 FPS line for long segments of play here, making it one of the worst performing Call of Duty stages in recent memory. So, the outlook for base Xbox One isn't good looking at the campaign, though what of the multiplayer? Honestly, this is where most of us will be spending our time, and it's struggling even here. Team deathmatch maps like the Crown Raceway aren't ideal, but still just about acceptable. 60 FPS with drops to 50 FPS during play. But then we turn to the likes of the Embassy stage with those two flanking buildings, and the often 50 FPS and under performance does genuinely affect how the game controls. We go a level down further in performance with the ground war mode. Here we have two teams of up to 32 players, it's a much larger map, there's vehicles, and it's arguably more of a concentrated point of action than Warzone 2 is in a majority of play. And again, Xbox One travels between 40 to 60 FPS here depending. Xbox One is a hard one to recommend then. Before we jump to the base PS4 tests, I will say, for a sense of perspective, there are obviously visual cutbacks too on these older machines. The cutbacks don't run especially deep insofar as the map layout is identical on the surface, but comparing to the absolute best case on console like Xbox Series X on right here, there's a superficial layer of world detail that is obviously dropped. In texture quality, shadows, screen space reflections, the motion blur sample quality, and tree detail too, there's a universal cut to most settings on Xbox One. And this broadly applies to base PS4 2 and to varying degrees PS4 Pro and One X. Here we have a very wide spectrum of GPU power on show in comparison just to make that difference obvious. And yet, to the developer's credit, looking at a level like Amsterdam, it's clear the game scales pretty successfully. In terms of the intent of its art, a console as old as the Xbox One here still turns in a recognisable scene. It's just that the biggest, most crucial dividing point here is the resolution targeting 900p on the older machine versus up to 4K on Series X. Back to the performance side, and it's PS4 up next. Interestingly, this follows suit from what we saw in the first 2019 Modern Warfare reboot, in that base PS4 appears to be a surprisingly robust package overall. The frame rate guns for 60 FPS, and broadly speaking it hits that mark, with 1080p as the target resolution. Again, this pixel count drops horizontally to 960 by 1080 at lowest, but the turnout performance-wise is seriously well optimized, all things considered. I found a few areas where it drops to 50 FPS quite obviously, the wet work mission being a classic example with its heavy water effects. I think it's telling though that the Dark Waters mission, the mission that dragged Xbox One down to the 30 FPS line, also just runs at around 50 FPS on PS4. PS4 then is not a perfect 60 FPS lock, but I think you'd agree it's a fine turnout for hardware released 9 years ago. 60 FPS with drops to 50 is roughly what you'd hope for here across the campaign, even with exceptional moments like this bridge collapse sequence taking it lower. As for multiplayer, kudos to Infinity Ward again. Honestly, team deathmatch maps run very respectably. So we have the Embassy level, which ran at 45 to 50 FPS on Xbox One, which now rolls out at a smooth 60 FPS most of the time, with drops to the mid-50s at peak action. It's really very hard to complain, and all signs again point to PS4 being the target machine for the project as a whole in balancing performance for 60. Impressively, even ground war action mostly runs between 55 to 60 FPS, it's all VSync 2, so no tearing right at the top, and the performance level is again pretty reasonable. Next up the power ladder is of course the PS4 Pro, a 4.2 teraflop machine. Historically, PS4 Pro has been the best performer, the closest to a tight 60 FPS lock, out of all last-gen consoles. It was the case in Modern Warfare in 2019, and it remains the case here. To prove the point, here are all the worst, most taxing areas again. The Dark Waters map being the first port of call, running at a nigh on perfect 60 FPS, barring a few one-off frame dips. And likewise we have the Wet Work mission, another formidable effects-heavy map that puts PS4 Pro between the 50 to 60 FPS mark. It's really excellent, the best result possible on console, short of upgrading to PS5 or Series X, and the target resolution is well judged too, at a dynamic 1536p, with the figure being chopped horizontally where needed again. It's such a brief summary for PS4 Pro because, honestly, it doesn't have much in the way of drops. Even the multiplayer, the big ground war action, unfolds mostly at 60 FPS here. Last up is Xbox One X. The blunt truth is Xbox One X runs worse than PS4 Pro in pure frame rate terms, instead choosing to render at a higher resolution. The target is a full 4K, higher than Pro's 1536p, and as expected, this scales horizontally to 1920 by 2160 lowest to account for GPU stress points. Clearly though, it's not enough. The target is just too ambitious, and it was a similar story for Xbox One X in previous Call of Duty games. If you recall, Warzone and Modern Warfare 2019 both had PS4 Pro pushing a smoother overall frame rate just by being better optimized around its limits. Today in Modern Warfare 2, again we see Xbox One X makes the same mistakes, leading to maps like Dark Waters running at around the 40 FPS line. For perspective, that's still, yes, higher than the base Xbox One, but lower than the base PS4, and with screen tearing thrown in for good measure. It's obviously a shame to see One X in this state, given its raw 6 teraflops of horsepower, and again, plenty of gameplay will unfold at 60 FPS, it's just the drops are often enough and significant enough in these set-piece missions that it really starts to stick out. And yes, sadly, that goes for the multiplayer mode as well. Team deathmatch games are usually acceptable at 60 FPS, though Ground War is predictably blighted by a constant 45 to 60 FPS level of performance. For a real competitive edge, for a locked 60 FPS, I'm afraid One X isn't the ideal console to be using right now, and I'll be interested to see how Warzone 2 runs here as well. For a final comparison, to put all of this into perspective, here's a four-way split. PS4 consoles on left, Xbox One consoles on right. I've switched off the tearing feed on the graph just for legibility, but yes, both Xbox consoles tear right at the top there. It paints an interesting picture of not specifically the power of each machine, but how well their limits are catered to. So for example, taking a snapshot of this bridge collapse sequence paints a pretty good picture. A spot that tumbles the frame rate on every console, where PS4 Pro is in pole position, base PS4 in second, Xbox One X just behind that, and in far last position, it's base Xbox One. The four last-gen consoles have so much in common in terms of their visual makeup, but it's just the resolution, and crucially the frame rates that divide them. The next big topic, of course, is Warzone 2, and it'll be fascinating to see how the game scales there, what the base Xbox One is capable of doing, and if PS4 continues to hold its own. For Modern Warfare 2 though, the campaign mode shows where Infinity Ward's priorities are. The bottom line is, yes, the game is playable on last-gen systems, especially PS4 Pro and base PS4. The one exception really is base Xbox One though. It's one to avoid if possible, honestly, not just for those 30 FPS sections in the campaign, but also the general frame rate level it runs at online. The big question going forward then is if these last-gen machines will still be a factor in development for the next major Call of Duty campaign. If the allure of PS4's still sizable user base is enough to keep the series running on older systems, or if we might see a truly focused next-generation effort. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.